Hey nerds. Now, a little while ago, George Lucas caused a bit of an argument by saying that artificial intelligence is progress and that it is the future whether we like it or not. He also said that rejecting it is a bit like choosing horses and buggies over cars. Now, the response online was fairly predictable. Lucas is apparently endorsing the destruction of creative work and the replacement of every artist in Hollywood with a laptop full of stolen material. But we're going to talk about what he was actually saying. The comments he made came from an interview about his career, his museum, and his philosophy of filmmaking. Now, right before AI came up, he had been discussing the old argument between film and digital cinematography. Now, his position is essentially, was essentially, that cinema is not defined by the particular machinery that is used to record it. Film is an emotional art form built from moving images. So naturally then the interviewer presented the case of AI because it seems to be the next stage of that argument. So in that context, he was not specifically asked whether studios should clone actors without meaningful consent, or train models on copyrighted films, or use generated scripts to avoid hiring writers. He did not endorse any use of generative models, but he did express a philosophy that he has held for most of his career, that filmmakers should not confuse the medium with the machinery used to make it. I am not saying that that lets him off the hook, let me be clear, but it does add some nuance, and I just think that we have to start paying attention to nuance again. Now, in the article and in most of the discussions then online today, artificial intelligence is treated as though it is just one single technology moving in one single direction towards this inevitable end goal. When Lucas was challenged about its risks, he talked about developing systems that could detect fabricated material, trace where it came from, and then hold somebody accountable for using it. This does address one problem, which is the problem of people using AI to create these convincing deceptions and deep fakes, and we absolutely need guardrails in place for this. But it doesn't address most of the concerns then that people have in creative industries and most of the conversations that are being raised. The key point in all of it, though, is that we don't actually know whose work the systems are trained on. We don't know whether the purpose of the technology is to support artists or to avoid employing them. So from my perspective, the online reaction exaggerated what Lucas actually said. But Lucas himself then also gave a fairly broad answer to a very complicated and a very specific topic. But the reason that I'm talking about this and why I find it particularly interesting, especially coming from George Lucas, is that he has spent so much of the past 50 years hearing that new technology that he was developing and endorsing would make cinema artificial and soulless. But more often than not, he was right and the critics were wrong. Now, his history absolutely does not make him right about AI. But it made me want to look at it in just a little bit more detail. Now, before I go any further, I do want to say that I did make a deep dive video a while back and a short series on the history and applications of artificial intelligence, as it is termed in this umbrella category. So if you want to learn some more about the basics of this technology, which is so much more than LLMs and image generators, you can check out that video or follow along that series. You see, the media kind of has us all in this tailspin today about generative AI. Nowadays, when people say AI, it's almost like the generative part is just silent, but AI is this broad class of tools and methods, and generative is just a small subset of it. So all generative AI is AI, but not all AI is generative AI. If you take anything from this video, just take that point. I'm Abby, I'm a physicist, and I like to talk about science in pop culture. Subscribe if that interests you, and please give this video a like, comment, or hype, or just something to interact, stop talking, or move on to the topic, please. Sorry, it's been a day. Now, before I go any further here, some people are going to say or make comments about how it all should just be banned, it's all invasive, or it's all... people will have comments like that. The point of doing this video isn't to try to find an argument in support of or against. The point is to help us find our way back to critical thinking, to find our way back to investigating, we see a comment online and we don't just take the comment at face value, we actually go and we try to understand where the comment came from before we pass our judgments or have our reactions. We are too reactionary as people these days, and I myself am finding media online way too difficult to engage with anymore, because it just feels like it is just this constant heightened sense of aggression and rage and anger. And I get it, we're all angry at the world, but I do just want to try to do something to help us find our way back to being curious and trying to understand where people's thought processes are coming from, whether we agree with it or not. So in saying that, the first thing that we can do is try to understand why George Lucas would think this way. Now, you have to understand that he did not just make Star Wars. Like, it's not just, oh, he's just the guy who made Star Wars. He used the success of his films to help build a significant part of the technical infrastructure through which all modern films are now made. Now, I'm not saying that like he personally invented computer animation or like sat down smoldering digital editing consoles together. His influence was more institutional. Like, he had money, he had production problems that existing studios could not solve, and he was willing to hire artists, engineers, and computer scientists to make it work the way that he imagined it in his mind. So the first thing that he gave to the world was industrial light and magic, one of the premier visual effects computer animation and digital studios in the world. I don't know why I put the word premier in there, because I clearly can't say that word. Premier? Premier? Was it supposed to be premiere? Is that what I was thinking in my... One of the best. I best felt like I couldn't find the terminology to properly explain just how consequential or how influential Industrial Light and Magic has been to our cinema going experiences. I've just realized that in my head it's premiere, which I think is an American... I could say it in my head, but I can't say it out loud. When Lucas began making Star Wars, the visual effects industry he needed didn't really exist. So in 1975, he assembled a new effects company to create it. ILM was initially built for just like one film, the first Star Wars movie, and it was built in a warehouse with less than 2 years to develop the equipment and the techniques that were needed to produce hundreds of effects shots. But on the downtime between Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, he lent the company to Steven Spielberg to make Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then again, in the gap between Return of the Jedi, he lent it to him for E.T. to be made. It wasn't just that the effects looked good. Lucas had helped create an organization where artists and engineers could develop new tools in response to the needs of an actual production. ILM then continued doing that for films well beyond Star Wars. But it wasn't just on the visual and practical effects side of filmmaking that his influence was. You see, traditional film editing was physical. Footage existed on these reels, and editors then had to like locate, cut, and then like rearrange actual pieces of film. George Lucas hated this so much, so he worked to develop Edit Droid, which was first demonstrated in 1984. It used laser discs and a computer interface to let editors move through footage and experiment with different arrangements without repeatedly like cutting the original material. And as if that wasn't enough, he was also investing in computer graphics long before there was ever a commercial product that would use it. Lucasfilm's computer division brought together researchers working on digital imaging, rendering, and animation, and in 1986, Steve Jobs bought that division from Lucas and established it as an independent company called Pixar. Again, the point here is not that Lucas personally created Pixar's technology or deserves the credit for everything that Pixar later achieved, but he provided the environment that early research could happen in before most studios saw any practical reason to fund it. So by the time Lucas made the Star Wars prequels, I know you don't like them, fine, he was arguing that films did not need to be photographed on celluloid at all. So for Attack of the Clones, Lucasfilm worked with Sony on a digital cinema camera that could capture footage at the traditional cinematic rate of 24 frames per second. The film became the first blockbuster shot entirely using digital cameras. Now, not every creative decision Lucas made with them was universally beloved, of course. I mean, Jar Jar Binks did not single-handedly convince the world that digital characters were the future or anything like that. We all don't like him. But the wider direction of what he was actually trying to achieve, or this vision that he could see for filmmaking, was very real. Digital editing became normal. Computer-generated characters and environments became normal. Digital cinematography became normal. Technologies that looked artificial or seemed unnecessary or inferior became just ordinary parts of our everyday filmmaking today. Now, if you think about that history, it might help why Lucas would then instinctively see AI as another stage in the same process. From his perspective, the chat probably looks fairly familiar, right? The technology is crude, people hate it when it currently produces, artists say it's not real, it's soulless, it's not true filmmaking, and eventually everyone just starts using it and it becomes normalized. And to some extent, he has a point. The problem here, though, is that AI is not just a new camera or a visual effects technique. The term is currently being used to describe several very different technologies doing very different things with very different consequences for the people whose work makes film possible. Now, before we decide whether Lucas is recognizing the next digital revolution, we should cover what it is that everybody is actually arguing about.
AI. Do you use AI? Absolutely. Do you use ChatGPT? Do you know ChatGPT? I love ChatGPT.
So like I said, AI is not one thing. The first problem with arguing about artificial intelligence is that nobody is necessarily arguing about the same thing. Now, as I mentioned, AI is this umbrella term. It can describe systems that will just classify images or recognize speech, predict outcomes, recommend content, make decisions, or generate entirely new material. Generative AI, the kind that produces synthetic text, images, audio, or video, is one part of that much larger category. But online, all of this tends to clump into one vague product called AI. So a tool that will automatically transcribe an interview is treated as though it is ethically identical to generating a script, but it's not. For this argument, I think there are three fairly broad topics or broad types of AI that we can talk about. So let's categorize them. So the first category we can set aside is assistive or analytical AI. Now, editors already use software that can identify cuts in old footage. It can track a moving subject, isolate dialogue, or reduce noise, search through large footage libraries, or automatically reframe a shot for a different aspect ratio. Adobe Premiere, for example, see, I can say it there. Adobe Premiere includes systems that detect scene changes, track and mask objects, they correct color, and they can follow the main action when changing a video's format. These tools analyze material that already exists, and it reduces some of the repetitive work involved in manipulating it. Now, these tools may change how jobs are done, and it is still reasonable, of course, to ask who benefits from that automation. But they are not designed to replace someone's job. They are designed to add shortcuts to specific processes. Condemning every single tool in this category because it has been marketed as AI would make very little sense for us, especially when people have already been using it for a long time before realizing that that's what it is. Some of it is simply just the latest version of software doing tedious things more quickly. The second category is a bit different, right, though? So in this one, we can call it controlled generative work, right? This might mean doing things like removing an unwanted object and then reconstructing the background behind it. Or it could mean like extending a set, creating a temporary set of images for pre-visualization. Now, this type of work might involve a model that is trained entirely on material that is owned by the production or is built around a performer who has knowingly agreed to a particular use. These systems are generative. The computer is producing material that was not originally captured, but it doesn't automatically make the process exploitative. The important questions are more about like, where does the data come from? Have the people who are involved with this, have they consented? What does the contract allow them to do? And then how is the result going to be reused? And is the artist still in control of the final work? Also, we can question whether this is taking the role of a paid artist or somebody who would traditionally be paid within this field. Essentially, a filmmaker that's using a model that is trained on their own drawings in order to test variations isn't necessarily doing the same thing as a studio using a model trained on thousands of artists who were never asked. And that brings us to the third category, which is just generative substitution. This is the use that most people are generally worried about. And I completely agree, like 100% hands down. It means generating an actor, which like I just think is really dumb. Like, I'm so sorry, just brief aside here, guys. An AI actor is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard of. This whole Tilly Norwood stuff, who's gonna care about that? It's interesting for a moment as like a curiosity of just seeing what you could potentially achieve. And then it just dies off pretty quickly. There's this big conversation right now about like the use of Botox and fillers in Hollywood and how it's making actors less expressive. So maybe there's like this curiosity with an AI actor of just like, oh, you know, it's interesting to see what they can do. But at the same time, you go to a red carpet so you can see an actor. You like, people like to spot, they like to get autographs. You can't do that with an AI computer generated, not real human being. We like interaction, we like humanity, we like to know that there is a person behind it. So I just don't think it's ever going to take off. I just think it's really dumb. Anyway, other things in this category are things like cloning a person's voice or their appearance without them having meaningful control over how it will be used. I don't like it even when they do have control. Producing scripts, concept art, or designs through systems trained on creative work whose makers were never paid or credited. Now, this will end up removing junior positions because a machine can now generate a quick approximation of the work that those roles used to provide. So at that point, the technology is not helping an artist operate a tool, it is using the accumulated work of artists to reduce the need to employ them. Now, I also want to say here, right, that these categories are not perfect. I know that, of course not. An assistive tool can still be used to like gut a department, and a controlled model could later be reused outside of its originally agreed purpose, right? A generative system could support one artist while also completely replacing another one. And a non-generative AI can also be exploitative. Of course it can. Look, I spoke about this in my AI deep dive video. Like, if we think about systems that are like ones that are used to monitor workers or to like rank job applicants, or ones that decide if a fake profile stealing all your videos is violating community guidelines. Facebook, I swear to God, take those pages down, you. So we can't ethically say generative AI bad, everything else fine. But what we can do is ask the right questions. Like, what is the system actually doing? What material was it used to, or what material was used to build it? Did the people who created that material consent to it being used? And then who owns what is produced? Who gets paid for this work? Whose work is being reduced or replaced? Who retains creative control? That's why what Lucas said has so much more nuance to it, because look, he's right that rejecting every technology described as AI would be incoherent. Some of these systems are simply new production tools, and artists may find them genuinely useful for their work. But saying AI is the future tells us like almost nothing here. It doesn't tell us which future and built from whose work, for whose benefit, or under whose control. So does all of this mean that George Lucas is right about AI? I mean, no. The online reaction has created a much more specific position than he actually expressed, which is what we kind of seem to do today. He wasn't asked about specific uses, and he was making this same broad argument that he has made throughout his entire career. So we shouldn't be surprised by his viewpoint that cinema is not defined by the machinery that is used to create it, and rejecting new tools simply because they are new is not a serious position. Given his history, it makes complete and perfect sense that he would have this viewpoint. Lucas watched digital editing, computer-generated characters like CGI, and digital cinematography go from being treated as artificial intrusions to becoming completely ordinary parts of filmmaking. Whether we agree with that or not isn't the argument here. Whether we like it or not isn't the argument here. What I'm trying to get across is that, as I said, AI is not one tool. Removing an object from a shot is not the same thing as like cloning somebody's voice. A model trained on material owned by the production is something that they get to make a choice about. Where it differs is if we're talking about something that is trained on the unlicensed work of thousands of artists. Now, none of this means that like every use of generative AI is automatically unethical. There are clearly ways that it could be used with licensed material, consenting performers and artists who remain in control of the work. But the point is that those conditions don't just like appear magically because the technology exists. There has to be specific measures put in place to protect people and their work. Now, Lucas is probably right that AI will become a part of filmmaking. Like, you may not want to hear it, you may not freaking like it, and I'm not saying that we should agree with it. But please understand that I am not specifically speaking about generative AI. What we don't know right now is what kind of film industry it will create. The argument here isn't really about artists versus technology. It's about who has the control, who's controlling the technology, like whose work does it depend on, and does it expand what an artist can do, or is it simply making it easier to just replace them? Look, I've said this sentiment before, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Aside from like the obvious case of it being theft and lacking creativity, there's also the case for the economy. The more you automate a system, the less staff you have to hire. The less people have an income, the less money people spend, the less need there is for your product. So you can go off and use some app to make your own movie, great, have a great time. But who's going to buy it? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. But I want to know what you guys think. I think that this is a very nuanced conversation. And like I said earlier, this isn't about trying to give the correct answer. This isn't about me saying this is what I think, or this is, or, you know, I think you should be able to use it, or it will happen, or it won't, or we shouldn't bother. I'm not making a commentary on what will happen. I don't know what will happen. What I think, from what I can see from our current technology and our experience with technology, is that there are already AI tools used in filmmaking. People just haven't realized that they are technically AI tools because we didn't have a proper knowledge within the public for many, many years of what AI developments were and what was happening in technology in terms of machine learning and deep learning algorithms. They've been a major, major, major thing for the past 20, 30 years. Since ChatGPT came out and it came really, like LLMs came really into the public realm, and now everyone kind of just thinks AI is, they're all just these LLMs. And it's not. And my only point that I ever want to make is about education and understanding and trying to stop some of that misinformation that's out there. So I just want to help people understand that the conversation that we have when we talk about AI tools is never solely about generative AI tools. And at the same time, while non-generative AI tools can be very beneficial and very helpful to somebody doing their job, especially if they're dealing with like things like big data or big analysis, or needing to do a lot of repetitive and search terms and structures that will take computationally a very, very long time, they can be very, very beneficial tools, but that does not mean that they are completely harmless. I recognize that completely. Like I said, I am not making the case for or against. I am just trying to say that there is a nuanced conversation, and I would really like us to normalize taking a time again, like we used to, when you would see something and you would go, I wonder what that's about. And you would go and you would learn what that was about before having an immediate reaction. There just seems to be this constant, immediate witch hunt reaction online whenever anyone says anything these days. And we have to have nuance. We have to have education around these topics. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to be critical of people, or I'm trying to say like, oh, you need to educate yourself. What I'm trying to say is, we have very little power against the people with like these large companies. Like, this is very clear. Let's not pretend. There are people out there who just think, oh, we should just eradicate it. Great. But what are you doing about it? You're not doing anything to eradicate it. You're not getting involved in politics. You're not getting involved in the conversations with the right people to ensure that things are being done. You have to have conversation. And the only way you can have conversation with people about how to prioritize artists and creatives and junior job roles, and in order to put in safeguarding and guidelines and consent and contracts and all that, you have to be educated. You have to understand the tools that are being talked about. You have to know what it is that you are arguing for or against. You can't just come in guns blazing, just saying, no, get rid of it all. It's not logical when you actually understand the broad scope of the topic beyond this discussion around generative AI. That's just something that I just want to be clear on my position, because I know that people kind of don't want to look in the gray areas anymore. People really just want you to either be on one side of the extreme. And I just think that we have to look in the gray areas. We have to understand topics on a deeper level in order to be able to advocate for ourselves and the work and what is happening in the world. But I stand by it at the end of the day. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Thanks for watching. Now, if you liked this video, you might like my deep dive on AI, which you can watch here, I have decided. Or you can check out my commentary playlist here. Now, I'm coming into the final leg of my PhD, so subscribe, please, to just give me a mental boost, because I am dying here. But anyway, stay nerdy.